Alright, in this third video, we're going to kind of talk about some specific strategies for grazing management, and there's some key concepts that we need to understand. So the first thing that we're going to do is we need to take a look at the relationship between the gain per animal, which is here on the side axis, and the grazing pressure. How many animals are we grazing? How much pressure are we putting on that forages? And so there's two ways to look at this. The first is if we look at the dotted line, that's going to be the gain per land area, like gain per acre. How many pounds of lamb are we raising per acre of forage production? The solid line that we have here is the gain per animal. So that is an individual steer's performance. That is an individual lamb's rate of gain. And so there's two different ways to look at it. And so what we see is that when we have a low grazing pressure down here on the yellow side of the screen, you'll notice that our gain per acre is going to be very low. However, the gain per animal is very high. Low grazing pressure means there's no competition for selection, and that animal is able to be very particular and pick and choose what it wants. So that's how we would actually maximize the gain per animal. But are we best utilizing our forage? Likely not. But what you'll see is that as we increase grazing pressure, what's going to happen is that we're going to start to see that drop in the gain per animal. And that's going to continue to drop as grazing pressure goes up. So, which makes sense. If we increase the amount of animals or we reduce the amount of forage availability, we are going to affect the individual animal's gain. Now, if we take a look at this from the flip side and take a look at how that impacts gain per acre, at the extremes of grazing pressure, we are actually going to have low gain per acre because grazing pressure, when it's low, is going to benefit the gain per animal, but because you have low grazing pressure, you don't have a lot of animals out there, so your gain per acre is low. We'll see that gain per acre peak kind of right in the middle here, but then again, as grazing pressure goes up, and then we're going to start seeing if we get too high, we're going to start seeing where that grazing pressure gets so high that we have so many animals that they can't select anything, and we're going to start seeing their gains drop off. And as a result, that gain per acre is also going to drop off. So what we have here is a situation where we have on the left, we are underutilizing or undergrazing when we're kind of behind that optimal range. We also have overgrazing on this side. But in the center where I've marked the green, you'll see that where we start to see the gain per animal drop off, but we have the peak for the gain per acre. That's kind of where we want to be considering our optimal grazing. And that would be the ideal areas to try to keep where we're optimizing gain per acre as well as gain per animal. So we may give up some gain individually, but we should be producing more units per acre of land and thus being more efficient with our forage resource. So that's kind of where we want to be, is in that middle section where we're right between where the two lines intersect, where we're going to just ahead of that gain per acre and before that animal gain drops too far off. Okay, we're going to talk about some various methods. The first method is continuous stocking, and that is where you have animals on a specific land area or a paddock all the time. Never rotates, never moves. This is the simplest system. It's just they're out there the entire time. You don't worry about moving fence. You don't worry about rotating livestock. But you're also going to see the most inconsistencies in forage utilization animals are going to come back and select what they want to. They're going to not select things that are unpalatable. And your pasture is going to get very uneven, and you run the risk of losing different species within your pasture because animals are going to overgraze some plants and undergraze other plants. So generally in pastures that are continuously stocked, you're going to see all three phases of forage growth. Way back when we talked about how phase one was high quality, low quantity, you're going to see some very short stuff, you're going to see some intermediate, but then you're also going to see forages that have matured, the inflorescence is showing, and they're not going to be palatable to the animals and not being selected. So over time, if you continuously stock over time, you're going to see a shift in your plant demographics, so to speak, in your plant population that could present a problem down the road. But it is one of the lower inputs, lower labor methods. Rotational stocking is something we're a little bit more familiar with. That's where we have paddocks of various sizes, and we will actually rotate the animals in a systematic way throughout those paddocks. And there's a variety of ways to do this, and there's no really right answer. It depends on your labor, your time. Some producers, like in the organic dairy side of things, they'll rotate and move animals every 12 hours. We kind of, at the sheep unit, I always learned from Wes Patton that the animals should never hear the same church bell twice, meaning generally about a 7-day gap onto a pasture and then move them is fairly ideal. And so the key component to rotational stocking is having adequate rest periods. Does the forage have time to rest? And that rest period may vary. During the summer, it could be around 21 to 28 days. In the summer, when that forage is growing fast. However, during the winter, it could be upwards of 75 to 90 days that it may need to rest before you come back to it. So having a rotational stocking plan and making sure you're allowing adequate rest of those forages is essential. Another one is called buffer stocking. And that's actually where you have a fence line and you actually have some conserved forage over here. And so that if it starts to get tight, you can let the animals get to the conserved forage, or you can save that for something else if your the rest of the paddock is handling up pretty well. It's creating a buffer zone for you that can kind of help with some of that. Strip grazing, and this is kind of where the dairy does this. We're starting to do this more and more. It's where you allocate the animals to a very specific strip and then move them forward a second strip, a third strip, etc. And now there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can just move the one fence and allocate different amounts of feed, or you can back fence it. So you can have the front fence, or you can have a back fence too. And ideally, the back fence makes the most sense in terms of strict forage management, because then they're not coming back to that stuff that they like that's going to be growing in that first section. However, that takes more labor. Then you have to consider water and mineral movements with the animals as you rotate through that. What I kind of like is where we do a strip, graze it, allow the animals into the second strip, and give them access to both, and then when we move them into the back of the half of the field, perhaps take water in the back half, and then back fence them a little bit into that second half, where we have to move water for half of the rotations, but not all of them. But there's some various things that you can do with the strip grazing that allows you to utilize the forage. Another one, and I forgot to change the name on the slide because of course I was just copying and pasting slides, is what I call the first last grazing. Let's change this name to first last. And this is where you take the animals, in this case the lactation group, and they have the highest nutrient requirements compared to a group of open ewes. If I were to do this at the sheep unit, I'd probably run the feeder lambs and replacement ewe lambs. They have the higher requirements ahead of our big mob of ewes that are going into breeding. But this lactation group is going to rotate through the pastures first, and then we're going to bring in the second group, which in this case would be the opens, and they're going to follow and clean up whatever that first group doesn't get. And so what you're doing is allowing the premium forage to go to the animals with the highest nutrient requirements, but you're bringing in the second group to also better utilize the second round of forage, and you move through a little bit faster, but you still have to make sure you do allow for adequate rest periods of these paddocks before you come back on them with the livestock. But this is a good one if you have a couple of groups that you want to kind of keep rotating. You can do this and move them through the pastures fairly easily. Another one that I did a lot of work with, especially when I was in Oklahoma, is where we would stockpile a forage. So in this example, we would have a paddock that we are not grazing and we allow to accumulate. At the sheep unit, we will stockpile probably 2, maybe 3 paddocks for fall grazing and winter grazing, and just kind of allow them to accumulate so that we have dry matter throughout the winter. So our rotation is going to be somewhat truncated, that we actually skip that one area. We allow it to accumulate, but rotate through the rest of them. And this gives you the flexibility to graze later. Or you could make hay, or do something else with that product. If you know that feed's going to be ahead of you, try to find a way to utilize it for later use. And stockpiling is a good way to do that. It's done a lot in the Midwest. We don't do it, I don't see as much out here, but we do try to utilize that because it is very effective, and then you allow the animals to harvest that forage, not mechanically harvest it. Or you don't have to mow it, because it's always kind of hard in a grazing system when you have to mow to keep forage height under control, and it just kind of seems like wasting the feed and increasing your costs when you have to do that. So to wrap up, if we have a successful grazing system, the things that we're going to want to do is maximize the number of grazing days. We want to try to optimize our forage use and get every ounce of nutrition we can from our pastures and maximize those grazing days. We also want to minimize our stored feed and supplements. We'd rather the animals harvest that forage as opposed to feeding hay or anything else. We try to match the nutritional needs of the livestock with the forage growth and quality. Can we manage that and do the best we can there? Utilize grazing management to minimize pest control. We try to use our rotational grazing to avoid parasite issues in the sheep. We've been getting better and better at doing that. Any excess, whether you stockpile it or whatever, put it up for hay or silage, stockpile it, do something to try to find a way to conserve that excess forage when you have it, for kind of basically save it for a rainy day when you need something and you're short dry matter, you'd have some conserved forage to come back to. And to wrap up the successful systems, make sure that you're allocating your nutrition to meet the various needs of livestock. You've got to have some flexibility too, because animals don't read textbooks, plants don't read textbooks. We know that things are supposed to go a certain way. Mother Nature does not read the textbook. And so we always have to have some flexibility. Do you have a buffer of conserved forage just in case a fire came through and took out one of your other fields? Where would you put your animals? You've got to have some flexibility for things like that. Make sure that you use plants and animals that fit the environment. Irrigated pasture, the orchard grass, rye grasses, clover, white clover, do very well in our environment. So we've got forages that fit our environment extremely well. From our sheep standpoint, if I was truly to have animals that fit our environment, I'd probably have Southdowns because they get fat on nothing. The blackface are a little higher maintenance, but it totally depends on your system. Try to recycle nutrients. Use grazing management to disperse fecal material. to try to get nutrients back into the soil. If you have a chance to compost and put some back out, whatever the case may be. But the bottom line is just to be practical and try to pencil everything out and make it profitable. That's what a successful system will be. And it's going to vary for every individual operation. The grazing systems are going to vary within an operation for different locations or sites that may have. So there's a lot of things to consider when put together that successful system. And that wraps this video up.